In this video and the next three videos, I'm going to be going over some of the content related to market models, in particular demand, supply, equilibrium, and changes in those particular functions. And so demand and supply, or supply and demand, however you like to know it, are very commonly held concepts in economics. Even the term supply and demand has worked its way into everyday speech, and we hear it all the time, people talking about why is the price of something the way it is, and the response often is, well, you know, it's supply and demand. And that often is a good enough explanation, particularly since I think we have, most of us, a good instinct for what demand and supply are. But what we want to do here is to talk about how we derive demand, how we derive supply, and then we'll come to a meeting point of both that we'll call equilibrium. So where do we come? Let's take demand first for no particular reason other than the fact that we tend to cover demand first. And one thing we should talk about, I mentioned in one of my previous videos, that we tend to put things of a dollar nature that can be represented as a dollar figure on the vertical axis of this first quadrant plane, and things of a numerical nature on this horizontal. And in particular, we can say, well, what are these dollar figures that we're talking about? Rather than putting the dollar sign, why don't we just refer to it as the price of the good, or P, and rather than the pound symbol here, we can just talk about the quantity of that good. And so as a result, one thing we should talk about here is we often refer to this as the PQ plane. The PQ plane, or more formally known as the basic market model. And this particular model is seen in pretty much every economics textbook of an introductory nature. And so this is something you should get very familiar with, get to know what's happening. And that is, we can talk about demand, we can talk about supply, in terms of those particular functions' relationship to the price and quantity of the good. So let's talk a little bit about demand first, and ask ourselves the question, how do economists come up with demand? Because if you look in the book, you'll see that demand is a downward sloping curve, and it is, for the most part, but how do economists come up with that? In other words, is it just theoretical, or is it observable and able to be derived from experience, through research, through testing? And the answer is yes, oftentimes it is. And that is, economists can do a number of techniques whereby data points on the demand side of a market, that is the buy side of any market, are plotted through research, and there may be some occasional outlying points there, but using a statistical technique we can draw these together and arrive at a demand curve that we'll simply call D. D, downward sloping, is sort of the mnemonic device. If you're ever wondering, is demand downward sloping or is supply downward sloping? It's demand for the most part, and this is the most conventional way of us viewing demand as something downward sloping. And that is, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity, hence the negative slope. And so this leads us then to something called the law of demand. And I should note that in economics we have very few laws. Unlike chemistry, physics, mathematics, there are very few laws. But what we do know is the fact that, for the most part, if a good obeys the law of demand, which is most goods, then there's going to be an inverse relationship between price and quantity. If the price of a good rises for whatever reason, typically the quantity that is demanded of that good is going to go down. And I'll put a little d subscript under quantity there so that we can differentiate between quantity demanded as opposed to quantity supplied. So this makes sense, doesn't it? If the price of a good is going up, buyers want less of that good, and maybe we'll shift over to some other good, not represented here. On the other hand, if the price goes down, it is the case that people are priced into it or find the good more attractive at that particular price, and so the quantity demand goes up. So this inverse relationship, P goes up, Q goes down, P goes down, Q goes up, is an important relationship, and it really expresses the inverse relationship between price and quantity. And that really is the heart of what the law of demand is all about, the inverse relationship between price and quantity. Okay? And as we get deeper into the course, we'll see some other configurations of demand that are a little bit different in terms of their slopes. It may not be 45 degrees down the way it sort of appears here. But nonetheless, this is a basic conceptualization of demand that shows us that there is this inverse relationship going on. And because there's an inverse relationship, the curve itself has a negative slope. Now I say curve, even though this looks like a straight line, and I've drawn a straight line through those data points using a technique that we won't be covering in this course, But in reality, I think most economists have observed that we really live in a curvy kind of world, and so as a result, a demand curve might look something more like that. And there are tools and techniques by which we can take research and observation and draw a curve that actually looks like a true demand curve. In other words, a true curve, which is where the term comes from. Okay? So think of demand as being downward sloping, D for demand, a downward sloping curve. What about the other side of the market? That is the supply side or the sell side of any particular market. And what does that look like? Again, through similar kind of techniques, we can call the supply curve as being upward sloping like that. And from there, we can extrapolate the law of supply. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have very few laws in economics. The law of demand and the law of supply are really about it, with some exceptions, and some things are called laws, which in fact may or may not be. Well, how's this different then between the law of demand and the law of supply? Well, here, the relationship between price and quantity are different. And that is, as the price of a good goes up, suppliers are willing to provide more of that good for obvious reasons. It's more incentive to do so, and so the quantity, which we'll simply call Q sub S, the S subscript denoting quantity supplied as being distinct from quantity demanded, also goes up. But if the price falls, then the quantity supply will also fall because it'll be less attractive to sellers. And so the law of supply then, as opposed to the law of demand, indicates the direct or positive relationship between price and quantity. So price and quantity are represented in different kinds of ways. And in fact, we would expect this upward sloping curve to have a positive slope, and it does. And if in fact this looks something like a straight line, if we were to assess most markets for supply, we'd probably find a pretty curvy supply curve looking something like that. Okay? And one final bit of this is the equilibrium bit. So if we put back the demand curve right there, and we overlaid it, this really shows us in pretty stark fashion the conflicting nature of demand versus supply. Demand downward sloping, supply upward sloping. They just look like they're in opposition to one another. And in fact, that's one particularly useful way of viewing the situation. Buyers want low prices, sellers want high prices. So how does any transaction ever take place if there's this fundamental conflict between what buyers want and what sellers want? Well, there's a meeting of the minds that comes together, and as a result, we know that transactions do occur, and at this meeting point between demand and supply, we simply call that particular condition one of equilibrium. Equilibrium. And what equilibrium simply is a relative state of balance in a market. A relative state of balance in a market. And it's a short-term thing, because we'll see in the next couple of videos some examples of out of equilibrium conditions getting going, and that is a different kind of thing altogether. So it's a relative state of balance in a market, and I should qualify that in a market as to price and quantity. As to price and quantity. So relative state of balance. And so if we were to take that point of equilibrium then, right here at the intersection of demand and supply, where the needs and wants of buyers correspond with the needs and wants of sellers, both in terms of price and in terms of quantity, we can simply refer to the points along the axis that corresponds to that ordered pair as being equilibrium price, which we'll put a little star, a little asterisk, that we usually pronounce P star, and a little asterisk by quantity that we refer to as equilibrium quantity, that we simply usually call just simply Q star. So equilibrium price is here, and equilibrium quantity is here. Equilibrium quantity. And furthermore, what's one important thing that we should know about this relationship between demand and supply and the formation of equilibrium is this. And I'll go ahead and erase this here just to draw one more bit of example to sort of hopefully clarify this, is that we end up with a condition where, how do we further define equilibrium? If we take a PQ plane and we draw a demand curve that's downward sloping and a supply curve that's upward sloping, like that, then what about these relationships between price and quantity demand and price and quantity supply? We can simply say that at the equilibrium quantity is a condition in which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. The quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Also, the equilibrium price is a stable price. It's what we call a market clearing price. And when you think of market clearing, it sort of suggests the idea that all goods that are demanded are the goods that are supplied. Well, the thing that we should know about a condition of equality where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied is this. That it's also a condition in which there are no surpluses. And a surplus condition is a case in which the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. In other words, there's too much quantity supplied, and there are also no shortages. And a shortage is a condition in which the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. The supply side is unable to fulfill the demand needs of the buy side. So in the case of equilibrium quantity, we say that there is an equality between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, such that there are no surpluses and no shortages. And if you think about it, even though it looks like maybe a hypothetical relationship, think about how many times we go to grocery stores and we walk, or drugstores, we walk around. We very often do not see whole shelves wiped out with massive shortages, nor do we see big spillover effects of too much merchandise flowing out of the stockroom. And so business firms have gotten better and better at managing the particular quantity supplied, and also it could be argued pretty convincingly that the quantity demanded for a lot of goods is also very stable. And isn't stability one of the definitions that we provided for equilibrium? So in the next couple of videos, I'll take this basic market model of demand and of supply, and we'll do some things to it that move it out of equilibrium. And by moving it out of equilibrium, we'll move to a new equilibrium, because one of the things that we should know about equilibrium in general is that it will change. And change is inevitable everywhere in economics, and so it'll be important for us to know what happens, what causes these changes in market variables, and what happens after those changes take place. So I hope this was helpful to you, and if you do want any further input one-on-one, please feel free to contact me.